Good evening, familia. This is Ray Collazo. You're watching and listening to Bomba Live, the talk show you've been waiting for your entire life. Thank you so much for joining us. We unfortunately, we were really just kind of gearing up for a July 4th weekend here at the Bomba Live family. Many of you saw the photos, and I encourage you to follow Bomba Live on social media channels, and particularly subscribe to our YouTube page. We actually just released an episode today related to, with one of my colleagues at Unidos US, Viviana Lopez Green, talking about a study that we recently released related to the lack of Latino voices in the racial equity conversation, particularly in the media around the country. My Philly crew, my Philly Bomba Live crew, shout out Christina, Vanessa, Dionelli, Zulai, accompanied me to our new Philly studios located on the 51st, the penthouse of the Pyramid Club, which is an iconic Philadelphia institution. So you're going to be seeing some exclusive episodes that we're about to produce that are going to be on top of Philadelphia, right across on the Comcast Tower. It's fantastic. So you're going to see a lot of wonderful pictures and moments from us kind of preparing for the next chapter of Bomba Live, the talk show you've been waiting for your whole life. But unfortunately, we had to do an emergency episode because what happened today at the Supreme Court, and we're going to give you details around the results from the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard Supreme Court decision. This fundamentally changes the complexion, the pun is intended, of higher education in our country. And I couldn't have this conversation around, kind of how this relates to my personal trajectory and my friend network and what this means for, kind of higher education and kind of the fabric of our country without my compadre, my ace in the hole, the producer of Bomba Live, Elbert Garcia.
Hey, Ray, how you doing?
I wish we were hanging out. What's up, dog? I wish we were hanging out under more positive circumstances. See, the thing is, Bomba Live needs to start a Discord channel because Bomba Live never stops. Even when I stop recording.
It never does.
So around 12:15 in the morning, East Coast time, I guess earlier today, technically, another very good friend of mine, of ours, who's part of the crew, who will remain nameless at the moment, sends us a group text, me, Albert, a bunch of other people that went to Columbia University, a bunch of other friends, goes, "Oh my God, are you watching this?" And then the other guy goes, "OMG, OMG, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark."
And of course, I had to be like, "What happened?" Right? Because it could have been anything, right? Could have been,
yeah, could have been. So I'm like, I just turned off the TV, and like the last half hour, I turned it off. I wasn't really paying attention to it. I was on my phone or doing something else or reading or something. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to put it on ESPN first because hopefully it's a sports thing. Because if it's on the news, it's probably like Putin went off on this clown in Belarus and the nukes are coming and it's over. And of course, it was our main man, Domingo German, threw a perfect game for the Yankees. So the world was not coming to an end. Actually, the Yankees just played a late game. And, Domingo German, God bless him. The seventh Dominican ever to throw, and only the 24th pitcher in Major League history to throw a perfect game.
I know it's only 24th pitcher. He might, and again, one of the very few actually Dominicans in terms of actually throw a perfect game. Maybe been the seventh to throw a no-hitter, but may have been the first one to actually throw a perfect game.
I think you're right about that. And then I'm sorry, our other guest is going to come on in a second, but to close the loop on this emergency, on this little quick aside, because I got to smile because this has been a rough afternoon, is that after when he returned back to the East Coast today, he went to our guy MVP bar with Jordan the Barber spot, which I took you guys to, and signed the Baller Fame wall, which I took y'all to. It's like a Dominican baseball pilgrimage uptown. A Puerto Rican guy had to do that for you. So, it all comes full circle, LB. You're on mute, LB.
Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, it all comes in full circle. And, it's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, the fact that he did it,
Yeah. So let's get to serious business. The people, and we appreciate watching on YouTube as well as the audio, the podcast feed on the Fountain Translation audio feed. So we want to bring on a guest of ours. It's really been for me, especially really kind of guiding us in sort of the deliberations, anticipating this decision, frankly. So, and a great friend to the show as well. And I'm really glad ever since I met her, I was like, one day Elbert and Laura are going to be on the show and it's going to be so much fun. A great friend to the show and our legal guru, Laura MacCleery. Welcome to Bomba.
Hi.
It's so much fun. Yeah, you just got here and it's already so much fun.
Yeah, I wish it was under better circumstances, but whatever pinch hitting I need to do.
Well, Laura, we really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. So why don't we just start from here, Laura? Just give us base setting. Obviously, there was a Supreme Court decision that we're not happy with today that impacts, affirmative action and how diversity is weighed in the admissions process, particularly for competitive universities. So why don't you just give us some table setting as what took place at the Supreme Court today?
Yeah, look, we're here on Bomba and they dropped the bomb. Really, this is not a surprise that they were going to do this. Everybody saw it coming because the court has telegraphed for years, particularly the conservatives, that it was headed in this direction. But all the same, you can think about it theoretically, and then when it happens, it feels really different, right? And today, it was a hard day. I mean, the court interpreted the Equal Protection Clause. It was a 6-3 decision of our Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which is, a core promise of equal protection under law, as not permitting universities to consider race in admissions. And let's be clear, when people think of affirmative action, it didn't work that way. It wasn't like a quota system. In fact, that was prohibited. It was that race was one factor among many, like at UNC, which University of North Carolina, which was part of the one part of the cases that were here, that were decided today. It was one factor among 40. So you would have like the oboe player and the sailing team guy, and then folks would be able to consider race in terms of its contributions to diversity in campus. And the court had held in a previous case that was acceptable, that you could have what was called race-conscious admissions, race as one factor among many for that admission. And today they reversed and said it was unconstitutional to have that as the admission systems. And of course, there were the dissents you mentioned. I mean, the Justices Jackson and Sotomayor, they were really strong in saying, look, this flips equal protection on its head. Equal protection was always about inclusiveness and desegregation. In other words, integrating the schools, like in Brown v. Board, because of the benefits of having all kinds of folks in school together, having all kinds of folks on campus together. That has inherent value. And the court had previously recognized that. And today it overturned that precedent and really flipped constitutional law around, saying, basically the way to get rid of racism is no longer to see race as a problem, which is,
as magical
thinking, delusional thinking, whatever you want to say.
And Mike Pence's apparently his expertise in this issue is that, well, I have 3 very privileged white kids that went to college, and so it's clear to me that everything is fine. So they let me know how things have changed. So we're talking to Laura MacCleery about the shameful Supreme Court decisions brought down today related to basically the dismantling affirmative action in higher education. What's infuriating, and I'm going to bring Elbert back into this conversation in a second to kind of talk about from a personal perspective. One of the things that's infuriating about this conversation, and if people don't know, I'm kind of I'm like what affirmative action is supposed to produce in a lot of ways. You could argue that I was very blessed to be able to go to Columbia University undergrad, and that opened up a lot of doors in my life, and it's that'll be on the tombstone probably. And the one of the things you learn when you go to a competitive university is that look, for every 100 people that apply, I think nowadays it's like 3% or something. When I got in, it was like 20%. So there's 20 people that get in, probably 50, 60 of the 100 would be fine there. You got to make judgment calls, and you got to try to, the best you can, balance the flavor of these universities. And when you go to these universities, almost everyone's brilliant, except the rich kids who clearly got in because of legacy. So can you talk about the disconnect between trying to prevent advantages when in fact legacy and just children from very wealthy backgrounds, what kind of advantage they have in higher education in our country?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, lots of universities admit kids of donors, legacy admissions, which means a prior generation went there and you have some family connection to the place, which is like saying, well, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, when there was such a massive discrepancy in terms of racialized advantage in wealth, you had family members that got a foot in the door. And now we're not going to allow you to consider race as one factor among many, but we'll continue to allow you to consider donor, admits and legacy admissions. And, what Justice Jackson said in the oral argument was, like, wait a second, you're going to continue to allow like the oboe player and the legacy admission, but you're going to say no to considering racial equity or racial considerations or ethnic considerations. Isn't that in itself a kind of equal protection violation? And in fact, I would urge that if you are, involved with an institution of higher education and you are not rethinking whether you should drop legacy admissions, drop donor admissions, really think critically about, what are the other categories that may have intergenerational racist and discriminatory effects. You are probably going to be vulnerable to legal challenge.
That was discussed on the Urban League's Zoom today with some legal scholars talking about how that's coming. That's coming, and rightfully so. I want to bring Elbert Garcia back into this conversation. Elbert, I was thinking a lot about you today because you in some ways in our network of friends really embody how this is supposed to work. That we set up these opportunities, not for handouts, but opportunities. And, disadvantaged youth, with gumption and chasing the American dream and living, carrying on the legacy of, in your case, your immigrant parents, to forge a path in this country. You did that. And, had the ability and the good fortune to get into elite high school, Columbia University, the list goes on and on. And so what saddened me today is that thinking about how the 15-year-old Elbert in Providence or Haverstraw, they're going to be fine ultimately, but one door closed or two doors closed for them today. And it's sad. And so Elbert, just as someone that, this conversation has been so central to our trajectory, just your thoughts, just as just personally at this moment in our history.
Well, I think there's a couple of things to think about, right? I think, and it'd be interesting because I think there are some legal things, that'd be great to talk to, about. But I think, the hardest thing to grapple with is that anyone who's ever walked into these institutions, and whether you're talking about institutions of higher learning, a high school, even you're talking about some of these institutions of power that we run in, there is this kind of a sense of like, well, how should the meritocracy be organized? Right. And so then you've come up to this, this ideal of saying like, well, it's the SAT scores or it's this or it's that. Right. But there's been plenty of evidence that have shown that, especially over the last 20 to 25 years, that as the income inequality has increased, that parents who have more means have utilized those means to get their kids to like be able to pass those things more. Right. So to be able to take, the tutors, not just an enrichment class, right? But the SAT prep, but all those things, right? And so there's also, I think, a class of folks.
There's a hack for everything,
parents and kids. Well, and there's a class of folks whose identity around their merit is based on that, right? But we also
inflating the kids' resumes.
Right.
I mean that's right. We have celebrities go to jail. That's happened.
And we know that sometimes half the job is also about not only just getting in, but also staying in. Right. And so we've also seen how things like SATs are not actually reflective of how successful you are in that college environment or high school environment, and actually whether or not you are also a leader, right, in those places. Right. We also see that in the same time, too, when we talk about even things like IQ and other stuff. Right. Yes, there is book smart. Right. But then we're also talking about what kind of leadership do we want to get and grab. And I think a lot of these places, because of the efforts of a lot of people, had begun over the last 25 to 30 years to say, wait, we wanted to redefine who we let in, right? And we want to redefine what it means to take these classes, to create these networks so that we can also funnel into this leadership pipeline. And look, and there's a lot of discussion around whether or not these places like Harvard and all these other places should be as elite and the value of elitism and all those kind of other things, right? But the truth of the matter is that, who is to say, we all know somebody who their life has been impacted, not just by going to these places and having these like titles, right? But even our own experiences have been impacted by those folks sitting in the classroom across diversity, right? Across, race and class, right? And so, I think there is definitely, the lack of acknowledgement of that, right? The lack of acknowledgement of that. And, and partly is, this is partly, par and course on what Roberts has done. Roberts did that 10 years ago when it came to voting rights. He said, "Oh, the South is fine. The South has created," and not looking at the reality, right? And we've seen in those last 10 years how that has regressed, right? We've seen in California when California went to affirmative, when it, in essence banned affirmative action on the state level, what has happened, right? And so I think there are actually two parallel tracks here that we have to like struggle with, right? One of which is like, this is a wrong decision. This is just wrong. It's not right. Right. But the other reality is also like, what do we do? Right. What do we do as a response? And the truth of the matter is that like higher ed has a greater responsibility to continue to diversify, the people who attend its classes and everywhere, not just at the college level, from the elementary school level to the high school level to all those things. Right. And the real question is, will we, especially folks who are in positions of power or have experienced that, will we stand up for those kids, for that 15-year-old kid in Haverstraw or Providence or whatever that we know? Will we continue to stand up for those folks? Will we continue to figure out a way to get them into the system, right? Because we know that color blindness doesn't work. I mean, it's almost like, again, it's like, one of the things about the Trump era was like we went back to some 80s bullshit, right? Right? It's like it's, it's not color blindness. It's not tolerance, right? Who the hell wants to live in a world where you're blind? Right, with no disrespect to like folks who are blind, seriously, like it doesn't make sense to be like, oh, I don't see you, right? How is that good? We have supposed to have evolved beyond that.
Well,
right?
I mean, didn't you see Friends and Seinfeld? You could be in the Upper West Side of Manhattan and never see a person of color or talk to them. So
well, and that's,
it happens.
It even happens in a place like La La Land, right? In that movie a couple of years ago, Into the La La Land, where you had like this thing about LA without having any Mexicans.
About Bear, I haven't seen it yet, but the Bears in Chicago, and everybody's like, you don't hear any Spanish music, people driving around, Albert, God, it's so personal to us. I think about how brilliant pardon my language, how brilliant a motherfucker you are. And I'm not a slouch. I have a healthy ego in my brain game. And I got the scholarship for high school, and I got another scholarship to get my senior year and the whole thing. And I think about you were literally Dominican Student of the Year in New York the year you graduated high school. Felipe Lopez was the sports guy of the year. So, I mean, the top of the top. And you shouldn't have to be that brilliant to have opportunity is what I'm trying to get at, right? Because you didn't need none of that. As long as you have the opportunity, you could be with anybody. Yeah. But so it's so insulting that we have to be like these, to just get on par. We have to be like supermen, superwomen, and just far exceed everything just to get a foot in the door. When again, this legacy piece just hangs, just casually is sitting there, flaunting itself in front of us.
Yeah, but I'm going to also be, and this is where the skeptic and the cynic of mine comes in, right? Because I think the other reality, yes, we can talk about legacy being bad, right? But no one's doing. How much you want to make a bet, Ray, that in 10 or 15 years, when again, we went into college and we were, if you look at in terms of the 80s and the early 90s, right? That was part of an increase in folks of color attending these institutions, right? These either, in traditionally, predominantly white institutions, right? Or these Ivy League places, right?
If I recall, just to give people if I could just give people context that real quick, is that, yes, that's true. And we went to, I think at the time, the most diverse Ivy, and I believe it was about 9% black, 9% white, which if you think about it, 9% black and 9% Latino approximately. And if you think about it, that was still well short, and that was considered progress, right? So anyway, to your point.
But just all I'm saying is just, and again, this is not to say that the legacy argument isn't valid, right? I totally believe that, right? But I also believe there is something like the narrative of America says that there's still a huge amount of people, of potential folks of color, who even their children would benefit from legacy at some point. And I'm almost sure that when that point gets to be, that is when suddenly the Supreme Court or the conservatives or anyone's going to be like, oh, yes, that's when we'll stop with legacy.
That's a bomba right there, Elbert. That's a bomba right there.
Because cuando le conviene, right? Cuando le conviene. Porque solamente cuando le conviene.
Look at the labor movement. It was flourishing when it was all white guys in hard hats and truck drivers. They get whatever they want. Then the labor became diverse, women and people of color. Chavate. Laura, I need Laura to get back in this conversation. But I'm glad to see. I love this passionate Elbert. This is why I wanted the emergency show. Laura, I wanted you to actually reflect on Elbert's earlier comment around what do we do now, or like kind of, it's a larger conversation, but just kind of your initial thoughts around reflecting on the decision that just happened hours ago. Just kind of like your initial thoughts around what now, because that's what a lot of activists are going to bed thinking about now. Like, oh my God, this goes beyond what Harvard and Yale have to do,
Yeah, Harvard and UNC are on the hook, obviously, but any university that had a similar admissions process is going to have to be affected by this decision. It's not just those two schools. And I think the main issue is that while the decision technically only applies to college admissions, the reasoning that the 6 judges on the Supreme Court are using is broad. And that there's going to be additional issues that get litigated past this, including diversity in hiring and other things. Now, those are not necessarily done as of today. We shouldn't say they're done. You don't want to overreact to this decision and let it spill over into parts of our lives that it doesn't directly affect yet. But the way these judges are writing, there isn't a boundary principle around how they're reasoning around equal protection. And that's really chilling, right? Because what you were saying about leadership is the thing, right? Like it's selective schools that are the pipeline to leadership around our public sector leaders, like government leaders, corporate sector leaders, military leaders. And what's so interesting is that the court exempted the military academies.
Yes.
Right? Because the Solicitor General, who represents the U.S. in the Supreme Court, told the court, and it was like a pin dropped when you're listening to the oral argument, like the whole thing changed, that military effectiveness was dependent on diverse leaders in the military. And when you think about it, like the same applies to every sector. You need diversity in leadership to lead a diverse country. We have 40% of the country is part of Black, Latino communities of color, Asian communities of color, right? And you're looking at 50% in a relatively short period of time. So how are you gonna have legitimacy in government? How are you gonna have cultural institutions, corporations that actually understand their role, right, and are able to lead and be responsive if you don't have a pipeline for leadership? And what the Solicitor General said was, it's not just the military academies, it's also the ROTC programs at every college and university that's going to be affected by this decision. And the court just ignored it, right? That's incoherent. Because
without Black and Latinos in our armed forces, you don't have a force.
Yeah, so they'll let them go, they'll allow the West Point and, the Air Force Academy and everything to be exempt from this ruling. But every other college university, which is where a lot of the military leadership comes from, right, is going to be subject to it. And you will see those effects, and you'll see those effects across every sector, right? So what do we do about it? Okay. I think people are still reading this decision and trying to read the tea leaves. Obviously, the first thing is communities of color, students of color, do not stand down. Do not count yourselves out. Right. Do not. What you saw in California when they passed Proposition 209 is a decline in applications, not just admissions, right, from students of color. So I think we have to be really clear in communicating. People belong on campus. It makes the universities better. It makes our whole society better. And it's important that students keep being the contender that they are capable of being, right? And that's the first message we can say. And the second is we have a long list of things that institutions of higher education need to do to support first-generation students, support students that come from backgrounds that demonstrate adversity or hardship or socioeconomic differences. You need to have like AmeriCorps volunteers in communities, working with community-based organizations, painting a picture for kids. You can do this, right? And you need to have them welcomed on campus and supported on campus in communities that are culturally appropriate, that help them problem solve, because first generation students are going to need that kind of just practical information to be able to stay. And then you need a whole thing around affordability, right? Which we're going to see come up tomorrow when the court rules on the student debt case. And, you know, sets aside a whole other set of
whole slate of decisions. I don't know if anyone's ever going to work on Sunday anymore after that other decision around religious liberty. But anyway, Elbert.
I was gonna say, you know, I think there's also a couple of things to think about too, right? I think I think it's very easy, especially when it comes to the court, for people to like cede their power to the legal system, right? And to lawyers who in general are risk averse, right? And so I hear that in terms of, especially when we're talking about like folks, you know, either foundations and other institutions are asking what are our options, what are things, right? And the reality also is that like there is still, while there is definitely lawsuits to come, right? There's also still the fight that has to be fought around those lawsuits and around those challenges, right? Yes, and so I think that there's also like a reality to say, you know, like what needs to happen is for people to actually get involved who have some measure of privilege and power to do that, right? To not have where we have seen, I think, for example, in the immigrant rights, you know, fight, that we have said, oh, let's make sure the people who are most vulnerable, the undocumented, the folks that we're going to put them on the front lines and have them do all the work and do all the things, right? Like there's an opportunity here for folks to think about, yes, there are some foundations, there are some institutions, there are some folks who are going to have to be willing to go to court, right? To support the way that they want to do that, right? And so the question becomes like, who's going to fund those efforts? Who's going to be able to allow people to have that court right? Because on the other side, this is the culmination of a fight that's with more than 20 years, and folks have spent all that money for that legal, you know, for those legal fights, right? They've had the money to be able to lose countless times to be able to build certain kind of things. So I do think that there's an ability here to be able to say, yes, the court has created this one thing, but there's a difference between the court. There's a difference between the court setting something up forever, and there's a difference between something saying like, okay, well, this is just the border, but this is also, there are other things to that it won't come into, right? And so I think this is where, again, I think we are blessed to have the Latino justices of the world, the Maldefs of the world, you know, in terms of those folks, people like you know, to be able to say like now, you know, more than we did maybe 15, 20 or 30 years ago, there's a cadre of folks who actually can fight this fight. And so I think we also have to remember that that those folks also need to be supported as well. And people also need to like to also not just roll over, right? Because I think there is a temptation to be able to say, let's work in this small box that the court has done. And I think we don't have to necessarily accept that.
No, we should not give up a single inch. We shouldn't give up a single inch, and we should make it all contested territory, whatever we can.
No question about it. I want to read a quote from another colleague of ours, Roxanne Garza, who's a great one of our top leaders related to the higher education advocacy element of this conversation. She tweeted earlier, "We must uphold our American values of an inclusive democracy and economy by affirming equal opportunity in higher education. #WeBelong." So to the point, and you know, Laura, your statement earlier really got me thinking about kind of how this ties into this political atmosphere we have kind of as the election season comes into play with the shameful, and Elbert's a former longtime Florida resident, so he's been keeping particularly close eye with the shameful Florida legislative session. The Florida governor Ron DeSantis, now presidential candidate Ron DeSantis, just orchestrated, you know, where there's these in the case of immigration, it's just one example, obviously 6-week abortion bans and all many other terrible things. That, you know, it's as much to create fear and hopelessness in diverse communities as the actual implementation, because they've even had, and you've seen it in Spanish, right? I'll be like, you know, Cuban American Republicans going to immigrant spaces saying, you know, none of y'all going to get, this is just for show and to scare people and for his political aspirations, not real. We're not going to destroy our agricultural economy here or our construction business or anything else. So, but to your point, Laura, is that this decision can compound the problem we're already having, particularly with, as you said, Elbert, Latino students applying to colleges, particularly more competitive colleges, because the fear of the costs and all the other factors that impede particularly first generation college students. And now this is even another this is even another impediment, because it's one thing to not get into Harvard, but you get to go to UMass Lowell. It's another thing to think, this system is just not for me, and not try to pursue higher education,
And I think there's two things also to just also know, right? Like, there's a reason why it's after higher education, right? There's a reason in terms of in terms of the political decision of targeting higher education, right? And the ripple effects of that, right? And we owe it. I mean, at the end of the day, Ray, look, we went to school, we got our degree, right? We took advantage of it. We're continuing to take it of it, right? But we've taken of it, right? Like, we have a responsibility to keep the door open, right? We've talked about somewhere that in some ways this decision has closed the door. I'd like to think that the door is a little ajar, right? maybe it's not locked, right? But we have a responsibility to keep that door open. We have to do it. And there's a reason why they targeted our kids. They targeted our kids and they targeted our generation, right? They did that. And that's not that is a direct assault and affront. And it's the same concept that goes all the way back to slavery, when they decide that you have to, that you criminalize people reading and writing, right? It goes all the way back, because if you give folks an education, right, you free their minds and you give them creativity and ability to be able to do things for themselves, right? And it all goes back to that, right? And whether it's implicit or explicit, it doesn't matter. Sorry.
Jump in, Laura.
Justice Sotomayor was talking about that and quoting Du Bois, right? That's what he writes about and in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, I just read too. I mean, there was a literacy test for a reason. There was bans on enslaved people being able to read and write for a reason, because education gives you self-respect, because it gives you a window onto the world and different ideas, and because it gives you power in a real sense, right? And so this is about a kind of power grab. The whole body of constitutional law around its suspicion of racial classifications and the way that's constructed allowed the court to do that. And what it is a normalization of whiteness. I mean, when you think about all racial categories are not the same. Jim Crow is not the same as affirmative action. It's just not. One is about putting people down and ensuring that they can't do a thing that is normalized and is about access to power. And the other one is about allowing them access to power. And the court treats them the same way intellectually. And it's just completely delusional or defunct, right? And it is going to be reversed. And I firmly believe this kind of decision and this whole line of cases dating back to the busing segregation cases that were sort of the precursor of this in terms of the conservative rulings are going to look like Plessy v. Ferguson in 50 years, right? They're going to be shameful aspects of our racist legacy as a country. But in the meantime, we just have to pry that door open and let people come through and support them in doing so. And so, we're working on those recommendations. We're thinking about what does the decision allow or not allow, which things are clearly in the green, right? And which we can full throttle, and which things are not giving up an inch and we should be ready to contest and fight for. And here's the reasoning. And so that, I think a lot of folks are doing that right now. You'll see a lot of action steps come out from organizations that have been working on this in the coming weeks.
It has been interesting, and have actually been California activists that we generally are in line with, who I guess have gone through this experience in California already, saying that, for the rest of the country, this isn't going to be as big a deal as you think. There's ways to work around it, basically. And so, and then some of the statistic they showed that 20 years ago or so, when that Black and Latino enrollment went down, and now it's been slowly inching up to be relatively on par to where it was 20 years ago. But it's like, why should we have to go through a generation of maneuvers to get back on par in this continuous attack?
And who gets lost?
Yeah.
And who gets lost in that, right? Who gets lost? I mean, look, you could talk about the bookend between Robert's decision, in Shelby, right, in terms of voting rights, 10 years ago, and the recent one now, right? And we can be like, oh, well, at least he seemed to have come around. But who lost in those 10 years, right? What's the harm that gets done in terms of those 10 years, right?
Congress.
But I also
a lot of things got lost. The
right?
White House
and a lot of things, right? A bunch
of
things that gets lost, right? I think the other thing that Lordy brings up a really good point too is that what this doesn't mean And I think this is important for especially those institutions of power, right? Because at the end of the day, this wasn't like, this wasn't Bronx Community College versus, Fulano, right? These were positions these are at places of institutions of power, right? This is at Harvard, this is at UNC, these are in big places, right? So I think it's important to also recognize that this does not absolve any institution of dealing with racial inequity, right? Like this does not say, right, that you get to be off the hook. And that continues to be both for the current inequities, but also for your past inequities, right? In terms of, and again, it brings up things like reparations and all those things, because again, like this is not like addressing racial inequity is not inherently discriminatory, right? And that's the thing that we have to that has to be like a baseline understanding that people have to do. And some people don't understand that, and people have to understand that.
Yo, Elbert, you dropping gems today, dog. You dropping some gems. That's why I need to have you on. This, I know this hit you in the heart. I'm sorry, Laura, but just we throw with hip hop. It's like, damn, I brought BDP out of retirement here. You know what I'm saying? Like he's spitting today. Thank you, brother, for the passion. Laura, please.
I was just saying, and anti-discrimination law still applies. So if you are found to be discriminating, all of the federal funding that is tied to those kinds of restrictions against being discriminatory, that's on you to figure out. And I think universities are going to be wrestling with this, and they're going to have to figure out, how do they support students of color? How do they make sure that they don't overreact or overcorrect to this decision and end up on the other side of the problem, which is, essentially downgrading applicants of color because they flagged that they're from a racial or ethnic group. And, that's also going to be something that the federal government's going to help them sort out. So the Department of Education is going to issue some guidance. The Biden administration has promised to do that really clarifies, probably over the summer, how to steer between these shoals and what institutions can and should do. And certainly, there's no substitute for race-conscious admissions. That's what the California experience shows. And it takes billions of dollars of outreach and rethinking your admissions process. And even there, you have 50% of high school graduates in California are Latino, and they are, 25% at most UC schools and 15% at UCLA and Berkeley. So you see that with all those efforts, you don't come close to where you should be in terms of admissions. And college has always lagged population, right? And so we have a huge job to do. There's just a huge job to do to make these institutions fair. And I think institutions should be thinking about which kids in the K through 12 years get access to AP courses. Does everyone really need to know calculus before they get into a selective institution?
Have you seen the shameful, was it Stuyvesant, the selective high school in New York City? The admission rates are unbeliipbly poor. LB, did you see that? 7 black kids got admitted this year, and 12 Latinos. But this is also something. Think about it, that our communities have been getting under-resourced on educational opportunities for decades. Decades. Right. And so in many ways, you can't do this on the cheap. Right. And in fact, what happens is that even in the cases like Stuyvesant, when you look into the difference between, let's say, our age wise, when folks like Danilo and stuff like that went into Brooklyn Tech and some of these stuff, the reason why that's happened is that some of those things that allowed in the public school system, the mentorship, the education, all those things are not there anymore. There's a whole privatization of help that goes in that favors folks who have means and disqualifies those that don't, right? And so again, we have to do a better job